The palace of Verelion floated above the planet's violet cloud seas like a mountain carved from light. From orbit it looked almost serene, its crystal towers reflecting the pale glow of the twin moons. But inside the palace, serenity had long since surrendered to exhaustion. For the past 17 days, the newest royal heir had cried without stopping. The sound echoed through the endless halls like an alarm no one could shut off. Royal physicians had tried everything: sonic lullaby fields tuned to the infant's neural frequency, molecular sleep vapors, ancient meditation chants recorded thousands of years earlier, even a small robotic animal designed to dance in gentle circles. Nothing worked. The princess cried, and cried, and cried. By the time Ethan Hale's shuttle descended onto the palace landing platform, the royal staff had developed the tired expressions of people who had forgotten what silence sounded like. Ethan stepped out of the transport wearing his usual simple gray medical jacket. Compared to the enormous alien architecture surrounding him, he felt like someone who had accidentally wandered into a museum exhibit titled "Extremely Impressive Things Humans Probably Shouldn't Touch." A group of tall palace guards waited for him at the landing platform. Their silver armor reflected the soft light of the sky, while their long, elegant ears curved slightly backward from their heads, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that he was not on Earth anymore. One of them stepped forward. "Medical consultant Ethan Hale," the guard said. "That's me," Ethan replied, adjusting the small diagnostic tablet hanging from his shoulder. "I usually handle rare neurological anomalies, unusual immune responses, and occasionally a stubborn space parasite. I've never treated a crying princess before, but I assume babies are mostly the same everywhere." The guard blinked slowly. Ethan smiled politely. "Except maybe with more lasers." No one laughed. That happened often when joking around alien royalty. The guard gestured toward the enormous palace doors. "You have been summoned urgently." "Judging by the noise," Ethan said, tilting his head toward the distant echo of crying somewhere inside the structure, "I figured it wasn't a casual appointment." The moment they stepped into the palace, the sound became louder. The crying traveled through the corridors in long, miserable waves. Ethan had heard plenty of distressed infants during his career, but this was different. There was something deeper in the sound, an exhaustion that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "How long has she been crying?" Ethan asked. 17 days, the guard replied. Ethan stopped walking. 17 days continuously? "Yes." Ethan slowly resumed walking again, his expression thoughtful. "On Earth, that would qualify as a world record and a medical emergency." The guard nodded once. "That is why you're here." They moved through halls so large that small floating lights drifted between the columns like glowing fish in an invisible ocean. Servants hurried past carrying medical scanners, nutrient vials, and various devices Ethan could not even begin to identify. Every face looked tired. One young attendant nearly collided with Ethan while rushing by with a tray of diagnostic instruments. "Sorry," Ethan said instinctively. The attendant paused and stared at him in confusion. Apparently apologizing was not standard palace protocol. The crying grew louder with every hallway they passed. Eventually they reached a wide corridor guarded by several armored soldiers. Beyond the door at the end waited the royal nursery. The guard beside Ethan spoke quietly. "Many specialists have tried to help the princess." "I read the reports," Ethan said. 43 doctors, 6 neural engineers, 2 xenobiologists, and someone listed only as spiritual consultant. I'm a little worried about following that act." None of them reacted. Ethan sighed. Tough audience. The doors opened. Warm bioluminescent light filled the nursery chamber. The room was beautiful, almost peaceful if one ignored the desperate crying echoing through it. Elegant instruments surrounded a floating cradle in the center of the room, while exhausted caretakers stood nearby monitoring various holographic displays. And beside the cradle stood Queen Vala. She looked remarkably human at first glance, tall, poised, with calm silver eyes and smooth pale skin. But the long, graceful ears extending behind her dark hair revealed her alien heritage. Even exhausted, she carried herself with the quiet gravity of someone used to commanding an entire world. Her gaze shifted toward Ethan as he entered. The crying infant lay inside the cradle, tiny hands waving angrily at the universe as if personally offended by existence itself. Ethan approached slowly. Well, he muttered quietly to himself, let's see what 17 days of royal screaming looks like. The moment he stepped into full view of the cradle, the crying stopped. Instantly, the sound vanished so suddenly that the silence felt almost violent. Every person in the room froze. The infant princess stared up at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. Then she made a small, happy noise. Ethan blinked. Okay, he said slowly. That's new. The silence lasted long enough for everyone in the nursery to notice how strange it felt. After 17 days of relentless crying, the sudden quiet felt almost suspicious. Ethan looked around the room slowly, half expecting someone to accuse him of performing illegal baby magic. No one spoke. One of the exhausted caretakers stared at the floating cradle as if it might start screaming again at any moment. Another checked the monitoring console twice, then a third time, like someone repeatedly checking whether gravity had suddenly stopped working. Inside the cradle, the princess simply watched Ethan. Her tiny hands moved curiously in the air, and a soft coo escaped her instead of the desperate wailing that had filled the palace corridors for weeks. Ethan pointed at himself. Just to clarify, he said carefully, was the crying already stopping before I came in? Or am I somehow responsible for this? No one answered. Queen Vala stepped closer to the cradle. Even without speaking, her presence carried authority that seemed to settle over the room like gravity. Her long ears tilted slightly forward as she studied the infant. The princess continued staring at Ethan. Then she smiled. One of the royal physicians made a small choking sound. Another whispered, "Impossible." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm glad she's feeling better, but I want to state for the record that I haven't done anything yet." Queen Vala looked at him. "Approach the cradle," she said. Her voice was calm, but the request clearly was not optional. Ethan stepped closer. The moment he moved within arm's reach of the cradle, the princess kicked her feet excitedly and waved her hands toward him. Several attendants leaned forward at once. One scientist quickly adjusted a floating scanner that began mapping the baby's neural activity. Ethan glanced down at the child. "Well," he said softly, "you seem a lot happier than the report suggested." The princess responded by grabbing the air in his direction, as if attempting to pull him closer, using extremely enthusiastic baby logic. Queen Vala observed the interaction carefully. "Remain where you are," she instructed the room. Several scanning devices floated closer to Ethan automatically. Thin blue beams passed over his body while holographic readouts filled the air. Ethan looked up at the machines hovering around him. "Is this the part where I start glowing?" he asked. A nearby technician replied seriously, "Not unless something is extremely wrong." "Good to know." The scanning continued. Behind Ethan, two scientists quietly discussed the princess's neural readings. "Her stress signals have collapsed completely." "That is impossible. They have not dropped once in 17 days. "Confirm the sensor." "It is confirmed." Ethan shifted his weight slightly and glanced down at the princess again. She watched him like he was the most fascinating creature in the galaxy. "That's a lot of pressure for a first impression," he murmured. The baby made a cheerful bubbling sound. Ethan sighed. "Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing either." One of the royal attendants carefully lifted the infant from the cradle and brought her slightly closer to Ethan. The princess immediately reached toward him. Ethan instinctively held out a finger. Tiny hands wrapped around it. The reaction was immediate. Every monitoring display in the room flickered as new data streamed across the screens. "Neural synchronization increasing," a scientist said. Another voice spoke from across the room. "Emotional resonance detected." Ethan blinked. "Those both sound like things you should explain." Queen Vala watched the displays, her expression unreadable. "Continue the scans," she said quietly. A larger diagnostic unit drifted closer to Ethan. A circular halo of light surrounded his head as the device began performing a deep genetic analysis. Ethan froze. "Okay," he said slowly. "That one looks expensive." The halo glowed brighter. Streams of genetic code scrolled across the holographic displays like falling stars. One of the researchers leaned closer to the data. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "That cannot be correct." Another scientist joined him. "What did you find?" The first researcher hesitated. "Genetic markers, not human." Ethan raised an eyebrow. I feel like that sentence should concern me. The scientist continued studying the display. These markers correspond to an extinct species. Queen Vala turned her head sharply. Which species? The room went quiet again. The researcher swallowed. The Solban kin. Several attendants exchanged uneasy looks. Ethan blinked slowly. And that sounds important. The researcher nodded without taking his eyes off the data. They disappeared nearly 1,000 years ago. Another scientist spoke in disbelief. The royal bloodline once formed biological bonds with them. Ethan looked down at the princess. She stared back at him with perfect calm, still holding his finger tightly. He exhaled slowly. So let me guess, he said. You're about to tell me I accidentally brought one of them with me. For several seconds, no one in the nursery spoke. The floating displays continued projecting streams of genetic data across the air, filling the quiet room with soft flickering light. Ethan still stood beside the cradle, his finger firmly captured by the tiny grip of the princess, who seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. The silence grew long enough that Ethan eventually cleared his throat. So, he said carefully, when scientists go quiet like that, is it usually good news or the kind that causes civilizations to panic? One of the researchers slowly turned toward him. We are still verifying the results. That's not very comforting. Another scientist tapped several commands into the hovering console. The display zoomed deeper into the genetic structures detected inside Ethan's cells. Strange branching sequences appeared, glowing in gold against the blue grid. These markers are not human, she said. Ethan looked down at himself, as if expecting to see something unusual. I've suspected that during tax season, he replied, but biologically speaking, I thought I was fairly standard. No one reacted. Ethan sighed quietly. Alien laboratories were consistently terrible audiences. Queen Vala stepped closer to the research display. Her long ears angled slightly forward, a subtle sign of intense attention among her people. Explain, she said. The scientist hesitated, clearly aware that explaining uncertain science to a queen was a delicate task. The Solban kin were once believed to share a rare biological resonance with the royal bloodline. Infants of the throne recognized them instinctively. Their presence stabilized early neural development. Queen Vala's gaze shifted toward Ethan. And you believe this human carries their genetic signature? We are not certain yet, but the markers are extremely similar. Ethan raised a finger. Well, technically, she's carrying my finger at the moment. Everyone glanced at the princess. She had not let go. In fact, she appeared increasingly pleased with the situation. Her small hand squeezed Ethan's finger enthusiastically while she made soft, bubbling sounds that were dramatically more cheerful than the desperate screaming that had haunted the palace for weeks. A nearby physician studied the infant's readings. Neural stress levels remain completely stable. Impossible, another whispered. They have not stabilized once since birth. Ethan shifted his weight. I'm starting to feel like I accidentally brought the universe's strangest baby toy. One of the technicians looked at him very seriously. You are not a toy. That's comforting. The scientists resumed analyzing the genetic scans. More sequences appeared on the display, forming complex patterns that seemed to pulse slowly with faint golden light. A researcher zoomed closer. These structures are dormant. What does that mean? Ethan asked. They exist in your genome, but are inactive. Like a biological spare part? Yes, though that comparison is extremely simplified. Ethan shrugged. I'm a doctor, not a poet. Across the room, another scanner began mapping the princess's brain activity again. A soft humming sound filled the nursery as the machine compared the infant's neural signals with Ethan's biological field. A moment later, the device produced a gentle chime. The technician operating it frowned. That result is not possible. Queen Vala turned toward him. What result? The technician hesitated before answering. Neural resonance. The room became quiet again. Ethan looked around. That phrase is starting to show up a lot today. The technician gestured toward the holographic display. Two complex waveforms floated side by side. One represented the infant princess, the other represented Ethan. The patterns were nearly identical. Your neurological biofield is synchronizing with hers. the scientist explained. Ethan stared at the display. That sounds extremely advanced for someone who hasn't even had breakfast yet. The princess giggled. The sound surprised everyone in the room. It was the first laugh anyone had heard from her since the day she was born. Several attendants stared at the infant as if witnessing a miracle. Queen Vala's expression changed slightly. The exhaustion had not vanished from her face, but something new appeared behind it, something fragile and unfamiliar. Hope. Ethan noticed the shift. He glanced between the queen and the baby. Well, he said quietly, that's definitely an improvement. The princess kicked her feet happily in the air. A moment later, Ethan felt something tugging gently at his finger. He looked down. The baby was trying to pull his hand closer. Ah, he murmured. Strong negotiation strategy. One of the scientists cleared his throat. If the soul bond genetic theory is correct, everyone turned toward him. The princess may be responding to him instinctively. Queen Vala spoke carefully. As kin. The word settled heavily in the room. Ethan blinked. I feel like that sentence is going to complicate my day. The researchers continued analyzing the genetic data. After several minutes, the lead scientist finally exhaled slowly. We will need additional testing to confirm the full implications. Ethan nodded. Great. I enjoy tests, especially the ones where I'm the test subject. The princess squeezed his finger again and made another delighted sound. Ethan looked down at her. You know, he said softly, I think you might be the only person in this entire palace who's happy about this situation. The infant responded with another cheerful laugh. Behind him, several exhausted attendants quietly smiled for the first time in days. Across the nursery, Queen Vala continued watching Ethan with careful, thoughtful eyes. Not as a stranger anymore, but not yet as something familiar either. Something far more complicated and far more dangerous to the balance of her court. The nursery was no longer the chaotic disaster it had been days earlier, but it was far from calm. Silence had replaced the endless crying, yet a different kind of tension now filled the room. One built from curiosity, political anxiety, and the uncomfortable realization that the entire palace might now depend on one very confused human. Ethan stood beside the floating cradle while 3 different scanning devices circled him like cautious mechanical birds. He raised an eyebrow. I just want to confirm something, he said. None of these machines are going to remove a limb without asking first, right? One of the technicians glanced up from her console. That would violate at least 6 research protocols. Only 6? She returned to her work without answering. The princess continued watching Ethan with bright, alert eyes. Every time he shifted slightly, her attention followed him as if he were the most fascinating object ever discovered by science. Ethan noticed. I'm flattered, he told her quietly. But if this keeps up, I'm going to develop a reputation as the galaxy's least qualified babysitter. The infant responded by grabbing his finger again. The nearby neural scanner immediately emitted another soft chime. A scientist looked up from the display. Stability levels rising. Another researcher leaned closer to the projection. That is the 5th increase in neural coherence since the human entered the chamber. Ethan pointed at the floating chart. That sounds very impressive. Unfortunately, I have no idea what it means. The lead physician explained carefully. The princess's brain activity was previously unstable. Her emotional signals fluctuated constantly, which is why she cried continuously. Ethan nodded. That part I understood. The physician gestured toward the synchronized waveforms displayed in the air. Now her neural patterns are aligning with yours. Ethan stared at the graphs. That sounds like something that should require paperwork. Across the room, several attendants quietly watched the baby. Many of them still looked exhausted, but now there was a cautious optimism spreading through the nursery. One caretaker whispered to another, She has not cried for almost an hour. The other responded softly, That has not happened since her birth. Queen Vala stood near the observation platform, silently studying the data as it flowed across the holographic displays. Her expression remained controlled, but the slight tilt of her long ears revealed the depth of her concentration. She approached Ethan slowly. Human. Ethan looked up. That's me. You may release the princess now. Ethan carefully attempted to withdraw his finger. The princess immediately tightened her grip. He froze. That was not approved by management. Several attendants exchanged quiet glances. Ethan tried again, gently. The baby refused to let go. Instead, she pulled his finger closer and began happily inspecting it like an important scientific discovery. Ethan sighed. Well, I suppose this is my life now. One of the scientists chuckled quietly before quickly pretending to cough. Queen Vella watched the interaction closely. Remain near the cradle, she said. Ethan nodded. Trust me, I'm not going anywhere. Apparently, I've been captured by someone who weighs less than 4 kilograms. A few attendants smiled despite themselves. Another scanning device drifted closer, projecting a soft golden field around both Ethan and the princess. The researchers began analyzing the resonance patterns again. After several minutes, the lead scientist spoke quietly to the queen. The bond is strengthening. Queen Vala's gaze remained fixed on Ethan. Explain. The soul bond genetic fragments within the human appear dormant in his species. However, the princess is activating them. Ethan blinked. Excuse me? The scientist turned toward him. Your biological field is responding to her presence. That sentence contains too many alarming words. The scientist continued calmly. The resonance appears mutual. Ethan looked down at the princess again. She smiled back at him. He sighed. Well, he said softly, at least someone here thinks this is going great. Across the nursery, a small hovering cradle unit began adjusting its position automatically. The device floated upwards slightly, responding to the baby's movement. Ethan leaned closer to examine it. What does this thing do exactly? The attendant answered. It stabilizes the infant's gravitational comfort field. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Of course it does. A moment later, he accidentally brushed the control panel. The cradle suddenly rose half a meter into the air. Ethan grabbed the edge instinctively. Okay, that feels like a design flaw. The princess burst into delighted laughter. Several attendants rushed forward. One of them quickly reset the cradle's position, while another tried unsuccessfully to hide her amusement. Ethan exhaled. Good news, he said. The patient finds the situation hilarious. Even Queen Vala allowed the faintest trace of a smile. The room slowly settled again. The princess remained calm, happily holding Ethan's finger while the scientists continued their scans. After a while, Ethan glanced toward the queen. So, he said carefully, I assume the next step in this situation involves more testing. Queen Vala studied him for a moment. Yes. Ethan nodded slowly. Just checking. The princess squeezed his finger again. Ethan looked down at her. You realize, he murmured quietly, that this is the strangest medical consultation I've ever had. The infant giggled softly. And somewhere in the palace beyond the nursery walls, rumors about the human who could silence the crying princess were already beginning to spread. The silence in the nursery had become so unfamiliar that every small sound now felt important. The gentle humming of medical scanners, the quiet steps of attendants moving across the polished floor, the occasional soft giggle from the princess whenever Ethan accidentally made an expression she apparently found entertaining. 17 days of crying had ended so abruptly that the palace staff still behaved as if the noise might return at any moment. Ethan remained beside the cradle like a man who had accidentally been promoted to a job he did not remember applying for. The princess still held one of his fingers with the firm determination of someone who had no intention of releasing it anytime soon. Ethan looked down at her. You know, he said quietly, most first meetings between strangers involve a handshake, not permanent finger capture. The baby responded with a pleased bubbling noise. One of the attendants nearby watched the interaction with cautious fascination. She responds to him immediately. Another caretaker nodded. The difference in her neural readings is undeniable. Across the room, 3 scientists continued studying the expanding layers of data surrounding Ethan's genetic scans. Every few minutes, another string of unfamiliar code appeared in the air, glowing softly like fragments of ancient language. One researcher leaned closer to the display. The dormant sequences are still reacting. Another frowned. That should not be possible without full genetic activation. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Whenever scientists say something shouldn't be possible, I start getting nervous. No one laughed. He sighed again. Tough crowd. The princess tugged gently on his finger again, drawing his attention back to her. Her wide eyes followed his face with complete focus, as if the rest of the enormous alien palace simply did not exist. Ethan tilted his head. Okay, I'm curious now. What exactly do you see when you look at me? The baby answered with another cheerful giggle. A nearby neural monitor chimed. One of the technicians immediately checked the display. Emotional stability remains at maximum. Another scientist added quietly. Her neurological stress patterns have completely vanished. Queen Vala stood near the observation console, listening carefully to every report. Her posture remained composed, but the exhaustion in her eyes had softened slightly now that the crying had stopped. She approached the cradle again. The attendants instinctively stepped aside. The queen studied her daughter for a long moment. The princess looked peaceful, curious, alert, and calm in a way she had never been since her birth. Then Vala's gaze shifted toward Ethan. You have been here 2 hours, she said. Ethan nodded. Feels longer. During that time, the princess has not cried once. Also correct. Queen Vala's long ears angled slightly forward. Our physicians could not achieve this result in 17 days. Ethan looked down at the baby again. Honestly, I feel like she deserves most of the credit. The princess squeezed his finger again. A faint smile appeared at the corner of the queen's mouth. Across the room, the lead geneticist suddenly spoke. Your Majesty, everyone turned. We have confirmed the origin of the dormant sequences. The holographic display expanded, projecting a detailed genetic map into the center of the room. The scientist pointed towards several glowing strands embedded deep within Ethan's DNA. These structures match archived soul bond kin records with 98% certainty. Several attendants exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan crossed his arms. That sounds impressively specific for something that supposedly went extinct 1,000 years ago. The scientist nodded. The soul bond kin once lived alongside the royal bloodline. Their presence stabilized the emotional development of royal heirs. Another researcher added quietly, they formed biological resonance bonds with infants. Ethan blinked slowly. That explains why everyone keeps using the word bond. The princess kicked her feet happily. The nearby cradle responded automatically, floating a few centimeters upward to adjust to her movement. Ethan quickly grabbed the side again. Okay, I'm still not used to the anti-gravity furniture. The baby burst into laughter. Even several attendants could not hide their smiles this time. The lead scientist continued. Without the soul bond kin, certain royal infants occasionally developed neurological instability. Ethan looked at the display again. And you believe that's what happened here? The scientist nodded. The princess's brain was unable to regulate its emotional feedback systems. Ethan glanced down at the infant. And somehow my weird ancient DNA is acting like a stabilizer. Correct. Ethan sighed softly. Well, that's not something they teach you in medical school. Across the room, Queen Vala remained silent for a long moment. Her gaze moved between Ethan and her daughter. The political weight of the situation was already forming behind her eyes. If the court discovered that a human carried the lost biological connection once held by the soul bond kin, the balance of power in the empire could shift overnight. Ethan noticed her thoughtful expression. That look usually means complicated decisions are coming. Queen Vala met his gaze. You may be correct. Ethan looked down at the princess again. She smiled up at him with complete trust. He sighed quietly. Well, he murmured to her, I hope you realize you've just made my travel schedule extremely complicated. The infant giggled again, and somewhere far beyond the nursery walls, the first whispers about the strange human calming the royal air were already spreading through the palace corridors like wildfire. By the time the palace lights shifted into the deep blue tones of evening, the entire citadel knew something unusual was happening in the royal nursery. Rumors traveled through alien palaces, faster than light. Servants whispered about the human who had silenced the crying air. Guards speculated that he possessed mysterious powers. One particularly imaginative technician claimed Ethan must be a hidden member of an ancient royal species. Ethan himself would have preferred a much simpler explanation, preferably one that involved sleep. Instead, he stood beside the floating cradle for the fourth consecutive hour, while the princess continued studying him like a fascinating new constellation. "Just so we're clear," Ethan murmured to the infant, "this is the longest job interview I've ever had." The princess answered by attempting to chew on his finger. "That is not part of the standard evaluation process." The baby giggled. Across the room, the research team continued running scan after scan. The holographic displays now filled nearly half the nursery, projecting layered maps of Ethan's genome alongside the princess's neural activity. A scientist spoke quietly to the others. "The resonance field is still stable." Another replied, "That should be weakening by now." "It isn't." Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "Should I be concerned that my biology keeps breaking your equipment?" "No," the scientist said calmly. "That would require the machines to malfunction." Ethan paused. That was not reassuring. The princess kicked happily again, causing the cradle's stabilizing field to shift slightly. The floating platform lifted a few centimeters and rotated gently before correcting itself. Ethan immediately grabbed the side again. "I still feel like gravity should not be optional in baby furniture." One of the attendants adjusted the control panel. "The cradle adapts to emotional fluctuations." Ethan looked at the laughing infant. "So it's basically a floating mood ring." The attendant blinked, unsure how to respond. Queen Vala entered the nursery again, her presence instantly quieting the room. Several attendants stepped aside respectfully, while the scientists lowered their voices. Ethan straightened slightly. "Good evening, Your Majesty." Vala approached the cradle slowly. The princess immediately noticed her and waved one tiny hand excitedly. The queen's long ears shifted forward slightly. "She is calm." "For the moment," Ethan said. "I make no promises about long-term performance." Queen Vala studied him. "You have remained here for several hours." Ethan shrugged. "Your staff seems reluctant to let me leave." "That is understandable." Ethan glanced toward the research team. "They're starting to look at me like a very important laboratory mouse." Vala's expression remained calm. "You are not a specimen." "Good," Ethan said, "because I've seen how scientific studies treat mice." The princess tugged on his finger again. Ethan sighed. "And apparently I'm also not allowed to resign." A quiet chuckle escaped one of the attendants before she quickly looked down. Queen Vala watched the infant carefully. "Has her condition changed?" The lead physician approached with a floating display. "Your Majesty, her neural patterns are now completely synchronized with the human's biofield." Vala's gaze sharpened. "Explain." The physician enlarged the holographic chart. Two streams of neural activity moved across the screen, almost perfectly aligned. When the human moves away from the cradle, her stress patterns return within minutes. Ethan nodded slowly. "That part we tested earlier." The physician continued. "But the synchronization is increasing." Another scientist added quietly, "The resonance is becoming stronger." Ethan frowned. "That sounds like something permanent." The researchers exchanged uncertain looks. "Possibly." Ethan glanced down at the princess again. She stared back at him with bright curiosity, still gripping his finger as if the idea of letting go had never even crossed her mind. "Well," he muttered softly, "that's not concerning at all." Queen Vala studied the displays silently. For the first time since the crisis began, the infant looked completely healthy, alert, calm, and happy. The queen slowly placed one hand on the edge of the cradle. The princess looked up at her. Then she laughed again. The sound filled the nursery like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Several attendants visibly relaxed. Ethan noticed. "You know," he said quietly, "I think that's the first time everyone here has breathed normally in a while." One attendant nodded. "We had begun to fear the princess might never be peaceful." Ethan scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, she seems peaceful now." The physician looked at him carefully. "Yes." Ethan tilted his head. That sounded like there was a second part to that sentence. The physician hesitated. "If the synchronization continues, the princess may become dependent on your presence." The room grew quiet again. Ethan blinked. "Define dependent," the scientist answered gently. "Without the resonance, her neural instability may return." Ethan looked down at the infant. She smiled up at him, completely unaware of the complicated biological and political storm forming around her. He sighed. Well, he murmured softly, that's going to make travel planning awkward. Across the nursery, Queen Vala continued watching him, not as a curiosity, not as a temporary solution, but as something far more complicated and far more important to the future of her child than anyone in the palace had expected. The royal assembly chamber had not been this crowded in years. Tall pillars of translucent crystal stretched upward toward a ceiling that glowed softly with simulated starlight. Representatives of the imperial court filled the circular hall, ministers, military commanders, scholars, and advisors, whose responsibilities normally involve matters far less unusual than a human who could calm the royal air. At the center of the chamber floated the royal platform. Queen Vala stood upon it with the quiet composure expected of a ruler whose decisions could alter the course of an empire. Beside her stood Ethan, and in a hovering cradle between them lay the princess, perfectly calm. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, while hundreds of alien eyes watched him. He leaned toward the queen and whispered quietly, "Just checking. Is there a polite way to stand during an interstellar political crisis?" Queen Vala kept her gaze forward. "Try not to fall over." That's reassuring advice. Across the chamber, a council minister stepped forward. His long ceremonial robes shimmered with faint geometric patterns as he addressed the queen. "Your Majesty, the scientific reports are clear. The human carries dormant genetic markers of the soul-bond kin. The princess's neurological stability now depends on his presence." Murmurs spread through the hall. Another council member spoke. "If the heir requires him to survive, then he must remain within the palace permanently." Ethan raised an eyebrow. He leaned slightly toward the queen again. That sounded suspiciously like a lifetime employment contract. Queen Vala did not respond immediately. The debate continued. Several nobles argued that Ethan should be placed under official royal authority. Others suggested he should be studied extensively to unlock the ancient genetic connection lost with the soul-bond species. One particularly enthusiastic advisor proposed building an entire research institute around him. Ethan quietly rubbed his temples. "I feel like my schedule is getting very full." The princess noticed his movement. She reached upward from the cradle and grabbed his finger again. The enormous chamber fell slightly quieter. Even the council members paused to watch. The infant smiled at Ethan with complete trust, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger like it had been in the nursery. Ethan looked down at her. "Well," he murmured, "you definitely know how to get attention." The princess giggled. The sound echoed softly through the chamber. Queen Vala finally stepped forward. The room fell completely silent. "For 17 days, she said, her voice calm but carrying easily across the hall. "My daughter suffered, while the greatest minds of this empire could not help her." The ministers listened carefully. Then a human arrived. Ethan nodded politely to no one in particular. "Hello." A few confused officials shifted awkwardly. Vala continued. The princess recognized him instantly. Her suffering ended the moment he entered the nursery. She looked down briefly at her daughter. The infant kicked her feet happily. "The court sees a biological resource," Vala said. Her gaze lifted again toward the assembly. "I see something else." The ministers waited. "A choice." The room remained silent. Vala turned slightly toward Ethan. "You did not ask for this role." Ethan nodded. "That is extremely accurate. You came to help. I was hoping for a quieter consultation, but yes." Several attendants in the chamber struggled not to smile. Vala faced the court again. "The human will not be imprisoned. He will not be owned. And he will not be forced to remain here." Murmurs erupted immediately. A senior minister stepped forward urgently. "Your Majesty, without him, the princess—" Vala raised one hand. The chamber fell silent again. "The princess will not be saved through captivity or fear." Her voice softened slightly. "She will grow beside someone who chooses to remain." Every eye slowly turned toward Ethan. He looked around the enormous hall. Then he looked down at the princess. She was watching him again with those same curious eyes that had stopped the crying in the nursery. Ethan sighed quietly. "Well," he said to her, "I suppose I've made worse career decisions." The princess giggled. Ethan straightened and addressed the queen. For the record, I still consider myself a doctor first. That is acceptable, Vala replied, and I reserve the right to complain occasionally. That is also acceptable. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. All right then. He glanced down at the baby again. Looks like I'm staying. The princess kicked her feet excitedly. Soft laughter spread through parts of the chamber. Even several ministers relaxed slightly. Queen Vala allowed herself a small smile. The crisis that had threatened the royal heir was over. Not because of ancient technology, not because of political strategy, but because a tired human doctor had walked into the nursery at exactly the right moment. Ethan gently adjusted his grip as the princess continued holding his finger. He looked down at her one more time. You realize, he said quietly, that you just rewrote my entire life plan. The infant